Hello, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Gore. I'm the Senior Vice President for Political Affairs at EDF Action, which is the advocacy arm of the Environmental Defense Fund. So thank you for being here. I'm really excited to have a conversation today with Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. And after that, stick around because I'll be continuing the conversation with David Kiva, who is the president of EDF Action. Now, EDF Action is building political power for bold and ambitious climate action through on-the-ground engagement and online advocacy. So for anybody on the phone who's ever sent an email or made a phone call to a member of Congress or some other politician in support of our policies and priorities, thank you very much. And for those of you who are joining us for the very first time, welcome. Now, Secretary Buttigieg doesn't need much introduction. He is, of course, leading the Department of Transportation, one of the biggest and oldest federal agencies. And he and his team have been integrating climate resilience and clean energy into the very mission of this agency. Now, we've got lots of questions for the Secretary. So if you're ready, we'll dive right in.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for hosting us and looking forward to the discussion.
So let's talk about the bipartisan infrastructure law. This was signed by the president late last year, but it's a lot more than just roads and bridges. It's got lots of pro-climate policies and programs included in it. So can you tell me a little bit about how you think about the intersection between infrastructure investments and efforts to combat climate change?
Well, thanks. It's a great place to begin. And first of all, let me again thank EDF, your leaders and members, for everything that you've done to support the administration's priorities on climate action, as reflected in our ongoing work on Build Back Better, and to your question, in the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed last year and that is now driving so much of what my department and my colleagues in other departments are doing. I would begin by pointing out that if you look at the US economy and the greenhouse gas emissions that come from the different sectors of the economy, the transportation sector actually accounts for the largest share. So to me, being that share of the problem means that transportation ought to take the responsibility of being the biggest share of the solution. And there is a lot in the bipartisan infrastructure law that's going to help us do that. And a lot of that, I think, has been visible and other parts have been missed. So things that are rightly visible and getting a lot of attention include the emphasis we're putting on electric vehicles. Look, we actually think the electric vehicle revolution will happen no matter what. The reason it was so important to invest in it in this law is that it's not guaranteed that it will happen in time to help us meet our climate challenge. And also, by the way, far from guaranteed that revolution will emerge in an equitable fashion and that it'll be a made in America electric vehicle revolution. That's why we think policy matters. And one policy that really matters is to make sure that there is a nationwide network of charging stations. 500,000 is what we are setting out to make sure America has by the end of this decade, so that wherever you live and wherever you're headed, you can be as confident of being able to fill up on in your electric vehicle as somebody is today when they set out on a road trip or across town in a gas-powered vehicle. And maybe we'll get to talk more about the EV investment, but I'm really enthusiastic about what's possible there. And we're already underway. We put out the guidance to the states on how to use how to apply for the formula dollars. We've set up a joint office with Secretary Granholm and the Department of Energy to structure that. It's a classic example of what we can do with good policy to drive good environmental outcomes through improved technology for climate. Having said that, I actually think there might be more climate power in something that was not considered to be a sort of green investment on its face, which is the transit part. So the more we can mode shift, the more that we can create options for people to have an alternative to sitting in a car on a congested freeway and get to where they're going some other way. There is enormous environmental benefit to that. And that's one of the reasons why we thought it was so important to make the largest federal investment in US history in transit. And as we do that, it may not be considered a climate title, but it's a very climate forward step that we can take, especially because we're also not only working to create more options for people to use transit, which is, again, intrinsically going to improve their carbon footprint, but also make transit itself cleaner, because transit can be cleaner than it is today. That's especially true in terms of low or no emission buses. And so we're going to be investing the resources needed to help more transit agencies acquire these emissions-free, and I would add much quieter buses. And by the way, also school buses. So a lot that we can do on that front. So these are just a couple of examples. There's also a carbon reduction program that is one of the 40 or so new programs being established in my department alone under this law, and a number of other measures that are going to make a big difference in the ability of our transportation sector to move out of being such a big contributor of greenhouse gases in the U.S. economic context.
Well, you mentioned the Build Back Better plan, and of course that passed the House in November, and it includes lots of other investments in the transportation sector and in reducing climate emissions. How do you see those proposals as complementing what's already been signed into law? How do you see those working together?
Well, we view them as very important. And I'll give you an example circling back to the electric vehicle picture. So we already know that we're at the point where owning an electric vehicle is cheaper. Cheaper to fill up on electrons than it is on gas. Cheaper to maintain because there are fewer moving parts. You don't have oil changes. You don't have spark plugs. You don't have a lot of things that can go wrong in a combustion engine car. But the sticker price can still be a big barrier, even if it means more savings overall over the life of the vehicle. You take these pickup trucks that are coming out of Detroit. They start around $40,000. A lot more affordable than people might think who are used to EVs as a kind of luxury vehicle, but still out of reach for a lot of families. It's why we propose these incentives in Build Back Better that would buy the cost down to basically the high 20s. And while we're at it, encourage US-made EV industries and encourage also the choice of a union, which we think is really important and the president strongly believes in. So that's an example of something touching transportation that's in Build Back Better amid the many climate-oriented investments there. And we're going to continue pushing for this. I'd be lying if I said I know exactly what legislative vehicle it will come in, what date we're going to get this done. But the American people already believe that this is the right thing to do. As often happens, we just got to get Capitol Hill to agree with the American people, and we're going to continue pushing that. And I think you'll hear a lot of these themes in the coming days and weeks from us, because whatever the final configuration is, we believe strongly in these policies.
Let's turn back to the infrastructure bill for a minute. A lot of that funding flows down through the states. And I'd be interested, how are you all working to make sure that low-income communities and communities of color are not overlooked or shortchanged as that money flows from Washington out across the country?
Yeah, this is really important because we need to make good on the administration's commitment and the president's commitment of what's called Justice 40, that at least 40% of the benefit of green investments go to communities that have been overburdened and underserved. And this, by the way, is a reversal from some of the patterns in transportation investment in the past, which either left out or sometimes even actively harmed lower income communities, communities of color. We have a chance to do better this time, to do it differently this time. And we're, of course, going to make sure we prioritize that in the discretionary programs that my department directly runs and that my office directly selects. But the bulk of the spending, the investment that comes out of my department goes through the states. And so we're working with our state partners on ensuring that there's equity and that there is climate considered in their steps. Sometimes that's a matter of states already want to get there and we need to support them in that. Other times we need to nudge our state partners along. One pattern that I found is that often communities are actually a little bit ahead of the states that they're in. So we also need to support local actors, mayors, counties, that are already prepared to make sure that underserved communities get the benefits of these investments, but sometimes feel like they're pushing uphill when they go to their state capitals. We want them to know that we're here to support them too.
So here at EDF, one of the things that we care a lot about and talk a lot about is methane and the impact that methane has on climate change. Now, EDF's, or rather DOT, has had an emerging role in protecting the environment by addressing methane leaks coming from the gas pipeline system. Can you talk a little bit about what you all have been doing in the space of methane?
Yeah, so one great thing about taking the seat in this agency is finding that there are a lot of very important functions of the Department of Transportation that people don't even know that we do. I bet most Americans don't know, for example, that our department is responsible for pipeline safety. We have PHMSA, Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. They do incredibly important, quiet work to make sure that we have a high level of safety in the movement of hazardous materials in this country. That includes methane. And recently we were able to update the jurisdiction of PHMSA to cover what are called feeder lines, which wind up accounting for an additional 400,000 some, sorry, they're called collection lines, I think, but 400,000 some miles of pipeline. In addition to the over 2 million miles that they were already looking after. Having that authority allows us to make sure that we're driving things like leak detection sooner rather than later, that there's accountability when there's an incident, but what's most important is, of course, not just accountability after the fact, but preventing it in the first place. As you know, pound for pound, methane is multiples in terms of its impact. So even what would seem like a marginal reduction in the methane that is getting into the atmosphere is as good as a substantial one with regard to carbon. We're going to be mindful of that as we continue to work on leaks and anything else that we can do to keep methane emissions under control through the authorities that we have as a department.
Well, let me ask you now, the last 2 years have been pretty much a whirlwind for you, a presidential run, working tirelessly for the election of Joe Biden, being nominated and confirmed into his cabinet, adopting twins, and all during a global pandemic. I'm interested in knowing what your secret for success is and how it is that you're looking so rested.
I'm glad I can create that impression, because that's unfortunately not at all the case. Rest is a distant memory. And I know all of us, especially across the last 2 years, have I think felt we've felt how much everything has been scrambled by the pandemic. And yet some of the things that have been the most, that have most turned my life upside down have also helped me reorient. And a good example is the arrival of our children. I became a father on about, we'd been hoping to adopt for a long time, but we got the call with about 24 hours notice and became parents, not only parents, but parents of twins. And there's nothing like holding your newborn child or children in your arms to remind you of what matters, and to reconnect you with why we do all of this. It's been especially important for me because I think in transportation, probably in climate generally, definitely in transportation, there is a bit of a bias to talk about things in terms of the objects that are involved. When we talk about roads or bridges or airplanes or trains, we're talking about these physical objects, which are only important because of what they mean to human beings. I'm sitting in my office and literally just past the webcam that I'm looking into, I can see cars crossing the Frederick Douglass Bridge and think about who's in the cars and how their lives are different now that that bridge is complete and hopefully better. And there's lights on in the neighborhood across the Anacostia River from where I'm sitting. And thinking about how the lives of the people who have those lights on are different and could be better or could be worse based on the decisions that we make. The human factor is obviously why any of this matters. And all these issues we talk about that are abstract, a lot of the time, or they sound concrete, literally concrete, right? A lot of the time. But they are a little bit dehumanized. I think for me, at least, becoming a parent has helped reconnect me with what's at stake. We did an event not long ago, I think we were in New Hampshire, with some folks who are advocating for regional rail, which again is not just a matter of convenience, it's a matter of climate, because the more people have that option of excellent rail, the less they're backed up on a highway, dragging 2 tons of metal with them just to be able to get to work. And one of the advocates there talked about being a mother, and she said, you know, I'm not the mother I wish I was because of this commute. And it's a moment like that that you realize this isn't just about dollars and cents. It's not just about minutes and seconds. It's about the way we relate to the people we love most. That's what's at stake in good transportation policy. That's what's at stake in good climate policy, right? Making sure that people's lives, especially people who are growing up into a world that will irreversibly bear the good or bad results of what we're doing right this minute, and in some cases won't be able to take back. You know, that's why we're doing all of this. And for me, again, I don't have any secrets, but as I've been trying to propel myself through the extraordinary demands of this wonderful job that I have, I imagine it's not unlike the people who are on this call who are propelling yourselves through some pretty demanding advocacy and activism, many of whom are volunteers who are doing this not necessarily as professionals, but just because you care about it, on top of whatever else you're doing in a day job and in your family. And I think what propels us through all that is that connection with what matters. And so I hope that all of us can hold on to that as we hopefully move into a comparatively more normal phase of the pandemic, as we continue to drive vaccination and see the back end of this Omicron spike. And I hope that's as propulsive for you as it has been for me doing this incredibly fulfilling and very demanding work.
Well, I love the way you focus this on people and made people the center of the answer that you just gave. I think that all of us appreciate the focus on making sure that climate change isn't just a scientific a construct here. This is something that really impacts people's lives and health all the time. And we need to make progress here. We need to reduce emissions and we need to fight this crisis. What are the technologies that you all are looking towards to try and accelerate the transition to clean transportation?
Well, EVs get the most attention, and EVs are definitely one of the most important and powerful tools that we have technologically. That's why we're trying to drive the price down. That's why we're trying to make sure that everybody can get charging infrastructure. By the way, one last editorial on EVs before I move on to that, because I know that folks on this call are spread throughout the country. I think we have a chance for a little bit of a countercultural emphasis right now to remind people in rural areas that they may be those who stand to benefit the most from adopting EVs because they're driving the most and they're spending the most money on gas or diesel. And rural residents are more likely to live in single family homes, which means at least some level of charging infrastructure probably already exists at your house. It's called the plug in your wall. A lot of people think you need specialized equipment to have an EV. You know, level 2 chargers are great, but you know, level 1 charger is literally just a plug-in. So I just wanted to mention that. But there's a lot more out there that we are pursuing and that we are exploring. Everything from technologies that optimize traffic. So when you look at air travel, which is not going to go electric overnight, some of the more modern techniques for air traffic control, unsexy stuff, but there's evidence that it could represent about a 15% reduction in emissions. Just things like a steady glide slope instead of a stair-step glide slope, and less time idling, taxiing on the ground with the engines. All these things can actually make a very big difference. Then we get into the things that are a little further into the future, like sustainable aviation fuels, and then eventually, in the further off future, alternative propulsion. And sustainable aviation fuels are something we really emphasized in Glasgow, and I want to continue pursuing. On the maritime side, you know, on one hand, moving a pound of goods over the ocean is about as climate friendly as it gets compared to anything else you can do, flying, driving. But because we do so much of it, it's still, and because the fuel the ships burn is so dirty, it is an important source of emissions. There are things that we have right now, technologies like those that allow you to, I'm simplifying a little bit, but basically plug in a ship when it's at berth instead of having it run its engine. I saw this in a recent visit to the ports of LA and Long Beach as we've been working on supply chain issues. Makes a big difference, as well as working toward cleaner propulsion. We've signed an agreement for green shipping corridors with Quad countries in India, Japan, and Australia. And I think there's a lot of real promise there. But again, we have some technologies right now, like trains, right? And not only making trains greener, which of course we'll continue to do, but just giving more people the option of taking a train to get to where they want to be. And part of that is as simple as ensuring that the trains we have are more reliable in terms of their schedule, which means improving and rebalancing the relationship between Amtrak and the Class 1 cargo rail lines on which Amtrak passenger trains run. If the schedules were a little more reliable, which they sometimes aren't through no fault of Amtrak's, more people would be able to count on the train, and we'd reduce more car trips and more emissions that way. So some of this stuff is not pie in the sky, Jetsons type technology. Some of it is, but better using the technologies we've already got, as well as cultivating the technologies that we envision for the future, I think puts us on a path toward being able to be really proud of how transportation is part of the solution.
Well, let me ask you one final question. You have a big agenda in front of you, made some progress here through the infrastructure bill, but you talked about a lot of things today that are yet to come. Tell me, what role can our members, our volunteers, our partners play in encouraging these bold investments in cleaner transportation, in equity, and in fighting climate change through the transportation sector?
Well, first, again, I want to tell you not to underestimate the role that you've already played. Your voice, your advocacy, your credibility has made a big difference, definitely in getting this infrastructure law passed and in continuing to advance the policies that we believe in. And I really am thankful for that. I know the president is as well, and the whole administration is. A lot of it's education, right? Making sure that that people understand the stakes, but also that we not just convey the climate challenge in terms of doom and horror stories and everything that could go wrong if we fail, but in terms of opportunity, especially speaking for transportation, which is a sector where we get to really break the old false choice between climate and jobs, right? Because we're creating jobs through climate action. I was just present a week or two ago celebrating the creation of electric vehicle charging manufacturing in the US. So not just the cars, but the chargers, just to give one example. Making sure we understand the upside of this. I'm a federal official, obviously, but I would say recognizing the power and the importance of the local, both because most of the dollars that my department's going to send out will ultimately be spent by state and local authorities. And because, frankly, when you're in a local environment, you can strip away some of the partisan baggage that makes it harder for us to have a rational conversation about any of these things at the federal level. And so some of those neighbor to neighbor conversations, some of those community conversations are really powerful. And I hope that those continue alongside with all the excellent federal advocacy that's creating such a wind at our backs in what remains obviously a very divided Washington. As you know, the American people are pretty strong in believing that we need to be more ambitious when it comes to climate. Mm-hmm. We're just trying to make sure that this town catches up to where the American people are. But I know how much you all are doing in both of those regards, the kind of general communication to people in your daily life, and then the organized and structured advocacy that you do. And both of those are making an enormous difference to help us get good things done so we can be proud of this. And so we can look back at the 2020s as the time when we definitely came to the brink, but we got away from the brink, we got away from the cliff by taking the steps that we needed to take to have an economy that everybody could thrive in and that is going to make as much sense in the 2050s as it does in the 2020s.
Well, you've been very generous with your time today. I want to give you the chance to make any kind of closing thoughts before we let you go, but really appreciate your being with us today.
Well, let me again just thank you for your partnership, for your commitment, for your invitation to be with you here. I encounter so many inspiring ideas when I'm traveling around the country, when I'm speaking with people who are passionate about opportunities to make our transportation sector part of the solution when it comes to climate. And we really can't do this work without you. If there's one thing I've found in this role in the cabinet, it's that I feel like at best I'm conducting sometimes, but others are playing the instruments of this kind of symphony that gets the job done. And so we're going to rely on that more than ever as we get into this kind of moment where there's so much noise and so much distraction out there, to keep us focused on the things that we're actually going to be remembered for. And I really believe we live in one of those moments where when they write the stories about what we did, certainly those of us in office at a time like this, the biggest thing anybody's going to remember or write about is what we did on climate. And I really think we've reached that point, especially when you layer in the questions of racial and economic justice that actually can't be separated from doing the right thing on climate. So let's take this as the opportunity to get it right. And I know that there are so many folks out there who are part of this conversation, who are part of this movement, who believe in that. And I can tell you that we as an administration continue to be committed to use every tool in our hand, from rulemakings to legislation to the unprecedented level of dollars that are flowing through departments like mine, to deliver those good results. And we know that we'll be held to a very high standard on that, and we welcome that because that's exactly what we came here to do.
Well, thank you again for being with us today. It's been a real pleasure to get a chance to talk to you about these important issues, and you took time out of your busy schedule to visit with us today. So thank you very much, and appreciate all the hard work that you've done on climate and transportation.
Likewise, thank you very much. Take care.
And now we are going to pivot. I want to introduce my colleague, the president of EDF Action, David Kiva, to continue the conversation. David recently joined us from the Biden White House. He worked at the Council for Environmental Quality, and prior to that worked on the Biden campaign, where he was a liaison with the climate and environmental community. He was also very active in many of the early states. So he's a longtime veteran of the Biden initiatives, including elevating climate as one of the priorities. So David, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here, Elizabeth. Although I do have one complaint. Can I share it with you and the folks who are
Please.
What did I do to you guys to make you make me follow Secretary Pete Buttigieg? He is so dynamic. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say he is easily the most dynamic Secretary of Transportation that we have ever had as a country. But he's also so substantive and so knowledgeable. And he's about as tough an act to follow as you could possibly get. But I'm honored to be here with you and with folks who are watching on their Zoom screens at home. So thank you for having me.
Well, David, you should be thanking me because we built a crowd for you for this conversation. So it was fun to talk to the secretary. Tell me, what was your biggest takeaway?
Right at the top, he said that he acknowledged that the transportation sector is the #1 emitter and talked about having a responsibility to act in correspondence with that. That was really, I've never heard a secretary of anything do that before. And to me, it speaks to the idea that the Biden administration up and down is just loaded with people who are aware of the climate crisis, are knowledgeable about its impacts, and are really thoughtful about the public policy levers that we can pull, both in terms of the legislation that we need to pass, but in terms of what's already been appropriated and passed and what they can do via executive action in order to get it right. And then in his closing comments, saying that when all is said and done and the history books are written about this administration, what's going to be remembered is the action that we took on climate. That was a remarkable thing to hear. And I want to echo poorly again, because I'm not Secretary Mayor Pete, that he shared that he felt that the actions that we, the collective we, the environmental community, have already taken have already had an impact, but there's more work to do. So I was truly inspired and honored to be a fly on the wall and get a chance to watch you and Secretary Pete in conversation. So thank you.
So David, let me ask you how you see EDF Action playing a role in advancing this agenda and pushing on climate-focused policy going forward.
Sure. I mean, look, getting it right on climate is hard. And you know this because you've worked in the US Senate and you've worked at EDF and EDF Action, and you've been around politics and government. It's far easier to kill something than to build something. So that we were able to help pass really transformative investments, many of which the Secretary just spoke about, in infrastructure, and to have climate embedded throughout all of it, both in terms of, I loved how the Secretary talked about Jetsons type technology, but also stuff that is a little more near term. What we didn't really talk about much was the whole sort of reason for doing an infrastructure bill in the first place, which was fixing roads and bridges. I understand, and he could have spoken to it far more eloquently than I can, that even those core infrastructure investments in roads and bridges, that they're going to try to do them in the most climate smart way that they possibly can, using resilient materials so that they withstand the impacts of the climate crisis, which is already upon us, but also using materials that have less impact on the climate and don't contribute to greenhouse gas emission as well. So there's a lot going on out there, but EDF and EDF Action sit at the absolute center of it. And the action that our members take has a meaningful impact. The Secretary didn't talk much about his time as mayor of South Bend, but everybody calls him Mayor Pete. As somebody who's held local office, I think he's well positioned to share that community impact matters, because most people don't pick up the phone and make a phone call into an office. Frankly, the first time you do it, it's kind of awkward. But after you've done it a couple of times, you recognize that, hey, I can do this. The people who are calling, they're not any better than I am or more knowledgeable or sophisticated than I am. And you recognize that those calls are logged and they make their way to the principals who we're trying to reach. So I'm so honored to be here at EDF Action and to help to hopefully lead us forward and to hopefully help us get to a place where we can help finish the rest of the job. The infrastructure law was great and is really big and transformative and important, but there are huge greenhouse gas emission reductions that are going to be found in the rest of the president's agenda, and there seems to be consensus around them. And the really exciting thing is that the American people, for the first time ever, when I was coming up in politics, there was this crazy false construct that I'm sure drove many of us nuts, that you could either do the right thing for the planet or do the right thing for the economy. The American people now understand that the jobs of the future are in clean energy. The open question is whether or not they're going to be here in the United States or somewhere else. And with the right public policy behind it, there's no reason why America can't be the global leader in clean energy and lead the rest of the world. So everyone watching at home, your voice matters. Use it.
One of the things that I really liked about his comments was putting people in the center of the conversation. Climate change policies are also, they're good for the economy, but they're also good for communities and families and health and all of those other benefits. So I thought it was really impressive that he talked about that human side. Too many times in Washington, I think we focus on the nuts and bolts of the policy and don't take that larger perspective and highlight the fact that it really has an impact on people's day-to-day life. And that's critically important here. You talked about jobs, and I think the health aspects are really important too.
Yeah, I mean, another stunning thing from that conversation was the idea that a Secretary of Transportation would talk about the environmental justice commitments and that commitment to get to Justice 40, but also acknowledge that for too long in our history as a country, transportation decisions were made without that lens and were made in a way that was discriminatory and caused harm to communities, too often to communities of color. So hearing that directly from somebody at the head of an enormously powerful and important agency was really sort of stunning to me, but also heartening, and made me think that there's somebody over there who seems to get it and wants to get it right. So I think at the end of the day, all of politics, if you can't translate what you're trying to do away from the sort of policy arcana and get it to somebody's kitchen table, you're not communicating it right. And I think we just heard from somebody who gets that, who sat at those kitchen tables and has had those discussions at his own, and understands that we have an obligation to communicate to everyone we know. We're already a believer that in the change that we need, of why this is important to them, because not everyone recognizes the role that climate change is already playing in their life, but everyone should, because it is having an impact on every single one of us. I think a lot about climate change's impacts, and it's easy when you watch the headlines. You see the wildfires that we've experienced throughout the American West, and you see the worsening hurricanes battering the Gulf Coast. But what you don't see every single day, but is no less real, are the impacts elsewhere. Farming is incredibly hard work. I feel fortunate that I don't have to do it. They're up awfully early, they go to bed awfully late, and they don't know too often until the very end of the year whether or not they're going to break even on an awful lot of sweat and an awful lot of investment and an awful lot of careful work. This cycle that we've been experiencing of drought and then extreme weather with derechos and increasing rain has only made, and unseasonable cold has only made it harder to be a farmer. Back on the campaign, in an area that I understand is near and dear to Secretary Buttigieg's heart, because his husband is from that part of the world, we ran a video focused on a cherry farmer in Western Michigan. And he was diversifying his crop selection and growing more apples and fewer cherries because cherries couldn't withstand the impact of increasingly erratic weather, and especially late season, into the springs, extreme frost that would kill off a huge percentage of his crop. And I'm not from Michigan, but I understand, I've talked to a lot of people who are. That's a state and an area where people have enormous civic pride in their tart cherries. It's tied up with the idea of being a Michigander. And the idea that they might not have cherries anymore ought to be scary to people for something that is closely associated with their idea of what they are as a state.
Well, at the end of the conversation, I asked the secretary how people on this call could help advance the agenda that he put forward. And I'm going to ask you the same question about how members and volunteers and partners and people on the phone right now can help to lock in some of the climate investments that we've been talking about today. This is obviously a top priority for us. So how can they help us help Congress move forward?
Yeah, well, first of all, if you're already using your voice and raising it and contacting your elected officials, thank you. It has, as Secretary Buttigieg shared, already had an impact and continues to have an impact. If you haven't yet tried it, trust me, it's not that scary. Try it. And don't just try it once, try it 2 or 3 times, because it's that 4th or 5th call or 4th or 5th text or email or letter that you send in that gets you feeling confident enough to say, hey, I can do this. It's not that hard and it does make a difference. More concretely, at EDF Action, we have a specific campaign going right now called Climate Can't Wait. So you all at home can, if you got a cell phone, and just about everybody does, can text ACT NOW, that's one word, ACTNOW, there it is on our screen, to 52886. That's 52886. It'll prompt you and tell you how to, it's a really neat tool that will probably ask you a couple of questions, including what your zip code is, if I have to guess. And then using that information, connect you through to your member of Congress, your US Senator. And that US Senate piece is especially important because we know that most of the president's climate agenda has passed through the House, but is a little bit, should we say, stuck at an impasse in the US Senate. This is as important a time as any for everyone to raise their voice individually so that there is a loud collective roar, so that US senators know that we're not taking our foot off the gas, and that we know that in order to truly get out in front of the climate crisis in this critical decade, we need strong legislation to do it. If you prefer not to text that way, there's another way for you to weigh in. You can go to our website, edfaction.org/actnow. It'll send you the same series of prompts, and you can do it from your laptop instead of from your phone. So please take a moment, don't delay. You can do it right now. Weigh in with your US Senator and your members of Congress and your elected officials who are there to represent you, and tell them what a priority getting it right on climate change is.
Thanks, David. And thanks to everybody who's taking action right now, or who's done it in the past, or who will be helping us out in the future. This has been a great conversation today. It's been a lot of fun talking to Secretary Buttigieg, and very happy that David could join us at the end of the conversation to continue this discussion.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you everyone at home for having me as a new part of the EDF Action family. I hope you can hear my excitement about how happy I am to be a part of such a special organization, and how excited I am to work with each and every single one of you to get bold solutions to the climate crisis over the finish line, and to make sure that they're centered in equity and justice.
Thanks, everyone.